Everyone. Thank you, Toastmaster of the evening. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and that is Matthew. And Matthew is on his pathway called, Presentation Mastery, and he's on his fourth and final speech, level 1 speech. And this particular project involves researching and presenting. And for this project, Matthew's chosen a very, very interesting and very, how shall I put this? Appropriate for the current times topic. And his speech is called Ancient Rome's Dirty Little Secret. So something I'm very curious to hear a lot more about, which I'm sure everyone else is similarly eager to hear about. And for this particular speech, Matthew's asked me to evaluate him on his ability to handle a serious topic with the appropriate sensitivity and also clarity. So yeah, look forward to Matthew's speech. Back over to you, Toastmaster of the evening.
Thanks so much, Andra. Matthew, when you're ready with the speech, Ancient Rome's Dirty Little Secrets, I'll hand the stage over to you. Thank you so much. All yours when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Madam Toastmaster. Just before I start in earnest, I would like to forewarn you all that I'm going to talk about an emotive topic, the history of enslavement in the West. I realise it's a difficult subject, and I would not be at all offended if any of you decide it's a subject you'd rather not hear about today. In the past few months, we've all been thinking about the cruelties which have been so prevalent in the course of human history. As I was choosing the topic for this speech, I realised that I don't know nearly as much about the history of enslavement as I ought to and I should like to. And since I've long been interested in the history of ancient Rome, and more specifically the Roman Republic, I thought I might share with you some of the things that I've found about slavery in that society. Anyone who's read or watched anything about ancient Rome probably knows it was a society in which enslavement was omnipresent. Whether we think about the gladiators who fought in the Colosseum, or the Jewish prisoners of war who were probably forced to build it, we know that slavery was a feature of everyday life. It's difficult, though, to find out about what life was like for those enslaved people. A point made by both Brent Shaw and Keith Bradley, professors of classics at Princeton University and the University of Notre Dame, references to which I'll add at the end of this speech, is that the extant sources tell us much more about the owners of enslaved people in general than they do about the people themselves. I'm going to start with the broad outlines before I talk a little bit about how experiences of enslavement in ancient Rome varied between different groups of people. What did it mean to be unfree in ancient Rome? An enslaved person's master could buy, sell, or harm them at will. At the end of the Republic, Emperor Augustus did introduce minor reforms to regulate the absolute extremes of mistreatment, but those reforms did little to temper the harshness of the institution itself. An enslaved person could not technically own property, nor was their testimony admissible in court except under torture. Cruelty was then not just tolerated in ancient Rome, it was a central part of its legal system. Slavery affected a vast number of people in ancient Rome. Estimates have ranged from 3 million enslaved people out of a total Italian population of 7.5 million, down to 1.5 million in 5 or 6 million total. Shaw points out, reasonably enough, that the business of estimating a figure is too difficult to be done with precision, but the scale of it should be clear enough. Some of these people would have been born to people who were themselves enslaved. Others, faced with debts they could not pay, would have sold themselves or their children. The largest group of enslaved people, though, was probably those captured as a result of warfare or piracy. At least from the years beginning 200 BC. We all know that the Roman Republic was a fiercely militaristic society, and every successful campaign, whether in modern-day France or Germany, North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean, resulted in tens of thousands of people being transported back to the Italian peninsula. For instance, in 168 BC, the general Aemilius Paulus sold 150,000 people after his victory at the Battle of Pydna. Just think about the scale of that number. The Roman authorities, meanwhile, tolerated widespread piracy, which saw people abducted from their homes and sold into slavery across the ocean. When we think about what all of this was like, it's easy to focus on the exceptions. Tiro, secretary to the orator and statesman Cicero, was liked, respected, and later freed by his master. Some slaves rose to positions of substantial power after being freed, such as Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus, who rose after the dictatorship of his former master Sulla. There are rare cases of slaves having slaves of their own. Bradley reports that Musicus Guranus had a retinue of 17, including a business agent, accountant, secretaries, a doctor, and 2 cooks. To focus on these exceptions would, however, be to miss the wood from the trees. The life of an enslaved person in Rome was, in general, at best one of drudgery, and at worst one of suffering. Perhaps the worst was saved for those unfortunates who were compelled to work in the gold and silver mines. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus reports that slaves there were literally worked to death. In general, whether there was work that was dangerous, unpleasant, or simply tedious, you would find slaves there. Although we'll never know much about these people due to the paucity of the sources, we can at least recognise their personhood. Some, like Spartacus and his followers, asserted their own agency by rebelling, taking up arms and trying to create a society of their own. 60 years before that, in the 130s BC, a slave called Eunice, famous for his powers of prophecy, managed to set himself up as a king in Sicily for several years. One did not, though, need to take up the sword or the pitchfork to carve out some measure of freedom. As Bradley points out, most enslaved people were much more likely to run away, to neglect their jobs, or to do them badly than they were to take up weapons. That room for manoeuvre was small, and it did nothing to protect them from the cruelties of the system under which they lived, a system which, according to Cam Gray at the University of Pennsylvania, lasted for at least half a millennium. But thinking about their agency should remind us of an obvious but forgettable truth. These were people with hopes, fears, dreams and schemes of their own. I'd like to end with a request. The next time you think about ancient Rome, don't think about triumphal arches or the Circus Maximus, or indeed the Colosseum behind me. Think about the people who built them, on whose difficult lives Roman greatness was built. Thank you very much for listening.